And welcome to a special on-location EWTN bookmark from the Napa Institute. Joining us on set is Mr. George Weigel, author of the new book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, How the Church Rediscovered Itself and Challenged the Modern World to Reform. Welcome. It's great to have you here. We had to come out to Napa to get you, but it was worth the trip.
Thank you.
So this particular book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, why is it ironic?
There are a lot of ironies in this story. I'm really retelling the history of the church over the past 250 years in its engagement with modern cultural, political, social, and economic life. And the way that story is usually told is the modern world is the protagonist and the church is always reacting. Some people want the church to resist, some people want the church to embrace, but it's a one-way street in terms of influence. I'm trying to show that beginning in the late 19th century, this became a real engagement. And the first irony is that out of this wrestling with modern life in all of its forms, the Catholic Church, through the Second Vatican Council, as authentically interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI, rediscovered the truth about itself. We're a missionary enterprise. This is an evangelical church. The second irony is that in the course of doing that, the church developed a social doctrine which just might help save the modern world from collapsing into the kind of cultural decadence and incoherence we see all around us today.
Now, you talk also in the prologue here, ironies in the fire, you talk about the two dimensions of history. What are they?
Well, there's history as fact, and then there's history as what do those facts mean. I use the analogy in that section you refer to of President Reagan. I mean, you have two historians who look at the same set of data. One says this is one of the most successful presidents in history, great economic performance, ends the Cold War, rides off into the sunset. The other historian, looking at exactly the same set of facts, says this was an amiable lightweight who lucked out and got out of town before his incapacities revealed themselves. History is always interpretation. And what I'm trying to do is shift the frame, shift the lens through which we view the history of the church over the past 250 years. Why? Because I think it gives us real hope for the future.
Now, in the beginning here, you have 4 vignettes. I thought that was interesting. It sounds like a great trivia question about the first pope who was actually on American territory.
Yeah. Pius IX is fleeing Rome in 1848, and he goes to the port of Gaeta, and there is old Ironsides, USS Constitution, now of course in Boston Harbor. And he visits the ship, which is of course sovereign American territory. So it's a great trivia question.
Right.
Everybody thinks Paul VI was the first pope to set foot on American territory. In fact, it was Pius IX, 120 years before.
Well, Paul VI, obviously, because he said Mass at Yankee Stadium, which was a wonderful thing. I remember that. Also with that, American seminarians actually offered to protect him?
Yeah, when the forces of the Italian Risorgimento were closing in on Rome in 1870, the then fairly new Pontifical North American College in Rome, the seminarians all signed a letter to the Pope saying, we're ready to join your papal zouaves or guards or whatever they were, and go defend the papal states. And the Pope wrote him back a letter, which you can see at the North American College today, saying, thanks very much, fellas. Study hard, pray hard, go home and be good priests.
Right. Now, jumping ahead, you talk about the last one is a Aparecida in Brazil, May 31, 2007, and you talk about the idea that walking away from that, the idea of Catholicism by osmosis, they admit is finished, and they talk about the church is called to a deep and profound rethinking of its mission. Is that what we were doing, Catholicism through osmosis?
What I mean by that is the notion that certain cultures, certain ethnic groups, certain national experiences pass on the faith to the next generation, almost genetically. That just doesn't work anymore. I just spent a month in Poland, where I teach every July, and the Polish church is really wrestling with the fact that, as I have put it to senior Polish churchmen, 40 years from now, Poles are not going to answer the question, why are you a Catholic, by saying, because I'm Polish. That just does not work under these 21st century cultural conditions. So that's why it's so important that in what John Paul II called the new evangelization, the church has rediscovered the fact that everyone is a missionary, each of us, and everywhere is mission territory, including the places that look really Catholic. Quebec looked really Catholic 60 years ago. Quebec is the most religiously arid place on the face of the earth between the North Pole and Tierra del Fuego today. It can go in a generation.
Right. Now you say secular modernity's false premise was that Catholicism intransigent in its true claims and often allied to authoritarian power was inimical to the modern project in its cultural, economic, social, and political forms. And you quote Voltaire talking about crushing the church. Why is that important for us to understand what their perspective was on the church?
Well, because it helps us understand the rather violent reaction to it by the church of the 19th century. I mean, in the first act of this drama in 5 acts, as I call it, it's hammer and tongs. It's serious headbutting. It's political modernity, beginning with the French Revolution, continuing in the Italian Risorgimento, Bismarck's Kulturkampf, really trying to destroy the church as a social force. And it's Gregory XVI and Pius IX just saying no, 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 no to virtually every facet of modern life. That all begins to change with the election of Pope Leo XIII, one of the real heroes of this book, in 1878. And he says, no, actually, modern world, we have something to talk about. Now, we have a proposal to make.
And wasn't he, as you kind of indicate with John the 23rd, in theory, supposed to be kind of like a stopgap pope?
Yeah, Pius IX had been pope for 32 years. Nobody wanted another run like that. So they elect this, what was considered an old guy in 1878, a 68-year-old man who proceeds to have the second longest pontificate in history until John Paul II beat him. He was a remarkable figure, Leo XIII, and virtually everything that we're wrestling with in the church today, and virtually all of the positive things that are happening in the church today, and there are many of them, were set in motion by that pontificate between 1878 and 1903.
Now, you make this statement, and somebody watching might say, wow, this is interesting. In the 21st century, the Catholic Church is more vital and more consequential than it was when Pius IX sought refuge on old Ironsides. People would say, how could that be?
Well, for one thing, there are about 4 times as many of us right now. I mean, it's a fundamental demographic fact. Secondly, there were virtually no Catholics in sub-Saharan Africa in the mid-19th century. That's the most dynamic growth area of the church today. Catholic Church in the United States had no real traction in the mid-19th century. The church is a very vital and vibrant force in the world today. John Paul II was arguably the most consequential political figure of the second half of the 20th century. No one would have anticipated that in 1869. So there are a lot of surprises in this story. There are a lot of ironies in the fire, as I put it. And that's what makes it absolutely fascinating, and why I think, it's one of the reasons why I think this should be a time of both sober assessment and purification and hope. You never know what surprise is coming.
What's coming. You say, for the history of modern Catholicism is in fact rather ironic, with modernity acting sometimes as a midwife and other times as an amazed observer. Go on to say, rather than killing Catholicism, the encounter with modernity has helped the Catholic Church rediscover some basic truths about itself. What would those be?
That we are fundamentally a missionary church. The church in which many of us grew up, the church of the Counter-Reformation, was a church of institutional maintenance. We built a lot of stuff, parishes, dioceses, universities, hospitals, healthcare systems, whatever, and maintaining those institutions was understood to be the primary function of the church. The challenge today is to turn those institutions into launch pads for mission, because the faith is not going to be transmitted unless it's proposed. When I was growing up in Baltimore in the 1950s, Catholicism was in the air we breathed. It is not in the air we're breathing today. And therefore this rediscovery of the missionary go and teach all nations. That's the first commandment to the church.
So you see that as that way of counteracting that idea that modernity isn't the protagonist, the church can be the protagonist.
Well, the church is the protagonist in many ways, and it's not it's not only in evangelization, although that's the first responsibility. We now have developed, beginning with Leo XIII, what we call a Catholic social doctrine, a way of thinking about culture, society, politics, economics, and their interaction, which really makes some sense, and which lifts up a nobler idea of freedom than this silly, childish, I did it my way notion of freedom that is dominating our culture today. So one of the reasons why we have to recover our credibility as an institution is so that we can make that proposal to the rest of society.
Now you also say that suppose Catholic traditionalists and Catholic progressives and conventional historians and the mainstream media are all wrong about what's going on now.
Yeah, because everyone tends to see this as a 200-year process in which the modern world acts and the church reacts. And I'm saying that's just not the way it works. And it's not the way it has worked, at least since 1878. The traditionalists think it's all attack from modernity and we have to resist to the last ditch. The progressives want to embrace modernity, not perhaps understanding some of its more corrosive aspects. But again, it's the modern world that's the initiator. We're the initiator in many respects.
Well, you say here in another irony, the Catholic Church helped the modern project to a deeper self-understanding. Suppose Catholicism helped modernity discover that it did not spring full-blown from the brow of Voltaire, but had a longer, far more complicated and much more interesting history that owed a great deal to biblical religion.
Well, we see this today in one of the many arguments going on in our country about the sources of the American founding. And there's one school of thought now emerging on the political right. It says America is basically a project of the Enlightenment, and specifically John Locke. And I'm saying that's not true, because John Locke is himself the product of an intellectual history. That intellectual history includes figures like Thomas Aquinas, and it includes books like the Bible. Biblical religion is one of the keystones of the civilization of the West. And if we forget that, we get in big trouble. That was one of the primary messages of Pope Benedict XVI for 8 years of his pontificate. And I'm trying to show here through a slightly tighter framing of the history, just the past 200 years, how that's actually worked between, say, the French Revolution and today.
And now you broke it out in a kind of an unusual way, in the sense of laying it out in 5 acts.
Right.
Is that because you see it as a drama?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I originally wanted to call this book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, a drama in 5 acts. Okay. And my publisher is in love with discursive subtitles, so I conceded to this discursive subtitle. But the book is structured as a drama. In Act 1, the church just says no to the modern world. In Act 2, the church gingerly explores the modern world. In Act 3, the church embraces modernity, sometimes too comprehensively. In Acts 4 and 5, which are what we're living through right now, because those last 2 acts.
It's like an overlap, you
yeah.
say, right? Yeah.
The church develops a social doctrine. It's a different way of looking at modernity. And the church rediscovers the truth about itself as a missionary enterprise. That's all dramatic. I mean, this is kind of high drama stuff. And between each one of those acts are what I call entr'actes, in which things are happening often below the surface that eventually pop up and shape the act to come.
So when you talk about Act 5, while Act 4 continues to unfold in a new embracing encounter between Catholicism and political modernity, The church begins to grapple with the challenges of 21st century evangelism. It is confronted by scandals that threaten Catholicism's capacity for public witness and for mission.
Yeah.
So when we talk about evangelizing, what do we mean when we say we need to evangelize? Because Catholics, a lot of them didn't grow up with the idea of being evangelical. That was kind of what Southern Baptists were. At least the average person might think that way.
What John Paul II meant by evangelism is each one of us has a responsibility as a baptized Christian to invite others into the community of the friends of Jesus Christ. That belongs to everybody. Mission is not just something that missionaries do. That's something we all do. Now, the primary place that most people are going to do that is in the family. But it's also something for the workplace, for your life as a consumer, for your life as a citizen. That's what I mean. And this is a response to this fact that the air we breathe isn't passing the faith along anymore.
Right.
The air we breathe is trying to snuff the faith.
Right, it's the exact opposite.
It's exact opposite.
Right.
And therefore, the only Catholicism with a future is what I called in a previous book an evangelical Catholicism.
Right.
A mission-oriented, mission-driven Catholicism. One way to think about this, Doug, is parishes sometimes, often, measure their vitality by taking a body count on a Sunday. You know, or dioceses do this. Let's say the third Sunday in October, we're going to count everybody who's in church. That's an institutional maintenance approach to thinking about the church. A more evangelical or mission-driven approach would be to say, of my parish, or your parish, or any parish, how many people entered the church at the Easter Vigil this year?
Right.
How many people did we bring back in to an active practice of the faith? That's the real measure of Catholic vitality these days.
Well, and in looking through this and in seeing this, do you think that people don't see that part of their mission is to revitalize not only the parish, but in a sense go out there and bring other people to become Catholics? Because in some ways there's this sense of the unknown Christian and everybody's basically okay.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a lot of confusion about the responsibilities of discipleship. And this is, frankly, a new idea for Catholics. When John Paul II wrote the encyclical Redemptoris Missio, the Mission of the Redeemer, 1991, and said everyone is a missionary. A lot of people said, huh? You know, what's that all about? Missionaries are people who go to exotic parts of the world. I am not a missionary. You say, no, actually you were baptized to be a missionary. So this is asking us to think about ourselves and to think about measuring our fidelity in a different way.
right. You make an interesting, you say both modernity and Catholicism have struggled with pluralism. I could see that from a Catholic. Why does modernity have trouble with pluralism?
Well, you look at it right now. Pluralism on steroids, or plurality on steroids, otherwise known as identity politics, is destroying democracies around the world. This inability to find a common grammar by which we can talk to each other and have a reasonable conversation about the common future is simply imploding all over the Western world. And that is a very dangerous thing. So we don't know how to manage a society in which a fundamental consensus on what is true and false, what is good and what is evil, what is noble and what is base, has broken down. That's a real problem.
Now, this was interesting. Way back in 1797 on Christmas Day, you talk about a lost opportunity having to do with the idea of understanding that democracy and the gospel were not incompatible.
Yeah, that was the Christmas sermon given by the man who eventually became Pope Pius VII. He was an intriguing figure in the early parts of Act One of this drama, because he was, in a sense, an anticipation of Leo XIII. Pius VII was open to the possibility that the new political forms that were emerging all over the world in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and the church could live together reasonably happily. Then Napoleon got into the act and essentially kidnapped the Pope, and that was the end of that. So it really was a lost opportunity, but rather alone among senior churchmen in the late 18th century. Cardinal Chiaramonte, as he then was open to the possibility of a Catholic underwriting of democratic politics.
There was a name that popped up. I happened to see it based on an interview you had done with your earlier book, Wilhelm Emanuel von Kettler.
Yeah.
You brought him up as being important.
Yeah, von Kettler was a great bishop in Germany in the 19th century. If Leo XIII is the papal founder of Catholic social doctrine, von Kettler is really the intellectual father of Catholic social thought. He had an enormous influence on Leo XIII. He was an extremely competent diocesan bishop. And he fought Bismarck's attempt to bring the church to heel in the so-called Kulturkampf, which at one point had driven most of the Catholic bishops out of Germany or into jail. He's a really quite extraordinary figure.
Near the end, you talk about the council without keys. Historians often remark that the Second Vatican Council, the 21st such gathering in 2 millennia of Catholic history, was unique, that it was not summoned to deal with a crisis. In retrospect, was there a crisis and we just didn't realize it at the time?
Well, we certainly didn't realize it at the time. I mean, I think what John the 23rd intended to do in summoning Vatican II was to gather all of this energy that had been set loose in the church by Leo XIII and his successors, focus it through the prism of an ecumenical council, and come out of the far end of that with a church rededicated to converting the modern world. But what's really unique about Vatican II, as I go on to say, is that it was a council without keys. Did not have a creed like Nicaea, did not have dogmatic definitions like Chalcedon and Ephesus, didn't commission a catechism like Trent, didn't condemn heresies, didn't write canons into the law of the church. It had 16 documents, but there was no thread tying them together. It would take 25 years, almost 30 years, and ultimately the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI to tie all of this together into a single tapestry and bring the church to where John the 23rd wanted it to be, a missionary enterprise for the conversion of the modern world.
You say an argument can be made that the gravest problem of political modernity in the 21st century is that it is having trouble giving an account of what it believes to be its greatest achievements.
Yeah, I think that's true because we have had a complete breakdown of first principles of political theory in the Western world. If you ask most of these people running for president today, why are there human rights? What is a human right? They have no idea how to answer that. If you ask them what freedom is, they will simply say freedom is choice. Well, that's just not true. I mean, that's a very childish understanding of freedom. It's like a kid banging on a piano. Learning to make music on a piano involves certain disciplines. Living freedom nobly requires certain disciplines, and it requires tethering freedom to truth and goodness. And all of this is being forgotten in the late modern world of politics today.
You talk about the progressive Catholicism. It seems determination is to tolerate, even embrace the many expressions of the sexual revolution, made it virtually impossible for those who still defended the rejection of Humanae Vitae to acknowledge the role that doctrinal dissent and confusion in the Catholic light generally had played in the abuse crisis of the 70s and the 80s as sexually dysfunctional clergy preyed, in the main, on young men. So you make that connection.
I've been making that connection for 17 years since I wrote the book, The Courage to be Catholic. And I said there has to be some connection between this dramatic spike in incidents of abuse from the late 60s to the mid to late 80s and a pattern of doctrinal and moral dissent in which people lived falsely. I mean, they claimed to believe what the church believed, but really didn't. And that kind of intellectual duplicity helped inform moral duplicity. No one else has ever explained why that spike took place
Right.
at that point, or why the incidence of these awful sins and crimes went down dramatically after John Paul II's reform of the priesthood kicked in. There is manifestly a connection between Catholic light and abusive behavior.
You also make the point as we wrap things up, no priest who has not shown himself a successful evangelist, deepening the faith of the people entrusted to his care and bringing others into the communion of disciples, that is, the church should be called to the episcopate.
Yeah, that seems to me a rather fundamental point. We need, as bishops, men who have demonstrated their capacities to bring others to Christ, whether that's in a parish setting, a diocesan-wide setting, a university setting, a seminary setting. But unless you have shown that you can be what the apostles whom you propose to succeed were, fundamentally evangelists, not CEOs, then you should not be called to the episcopate.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug.
Mr.
Good to be
Weigel,
with
finally
you
the
again.
time to spend time here on Bookmark on location in Napa, the book, The Irony of Modern Catholic History, How the Church Rediscovered Itself and Challenged the Modern World to Reform, published by Basic Books, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.